Most mornings before sunrise, the hill echoed with the sound of stones clinking, dragged across dew-wet grass by the smallest figure in the village. Bent under the weight of granite and shale, the boy worked alone, rolling boulders down goat paths and heaving armfuls of fieldstone into awkward piles at the edge of his little farm. Every trip left scrapes on his shins, sweat down his brow, but he pressed on, even as neighbors walked by whistling or shaking their heads. "Why haul more trouble to your own land?" they teased, bets placed on how long he'd last. The old men at the shop just laughed, insisting he'd tire out or break his back long before a single tree could take root. But for every jeer or sideways glance, the boy answered with another stone on his growing wall, building something only he could see, not a burden, but a shield, one that would quietly ready his farm for a storm nobody else believed would come. In a village where every farm had its share of scars, stories about rocks carried special weight. At the bakery, women remembered grandfathers who'd lost entire cornfields when boulders slid down the slopes during the wet years. They shook their heads over coffee, saying rocks were curses, not blessings. At dinner tables, fathers reminded sons how hauling stones had ruined more backs than drought or blight. "You can't plant in rocks," one farmer snorted, watching the boy lug another load up the lane. "You bury your sweat and get nothing but sore muscles." Old Mrs. Nettie cackled to her neighbors that maybe the boy was collecting stones for his own grave, and the joke took on a life of its own. Kids would sneak up the road on dares, counting his piles and daring each other to touch a grave marker. Even friends his own age gave up helping after the first week, bored or embarrassed by the relentless work. One uncle tried to intervene, urging the boy to trade his empty wall building for plowing or seeding. "Farmers fight rocks. They don't bring more. Why work so hard just to make things worse?" And yet, even as the teasing wore him down, the boy felt something stubborn wedge inside his heart. He brushed the dust from his hands and decided he would carry rocks until either the hillside changed or he learned for himself why everyone else had given up. The question that echoed through town, "Why would anyone do this?" was the very reason he kept waking early and facing the impossible. Day after day, his world shrank to the rhythm of lifting, rolling, and staggering through mud. His palms blistered and his arms ached. Sleeves tore on sharp granite, and his boots leaked water from spring's constant drizzle. The piles he built seemed to shrink overnight as rain washed silt over them, and for every wall begun, it felt as if the earth stole a little more of his effort by morning. Siblings teased him for coming to supper covered in bruises and stone dust. His eyes red with fatigue, clothes stiff with sweat. Some days he thought about quitting. He'd look at his hands, scabbed and tender, and ask himself if anyone would even notice if he stopped. The wind seemed to erase his footprints before noon, and no matter how long he worked, the slope always looked the same, gray, broken, empty. One afternoon, a squall rolled in and scattered all his progress in a heartbeat. The terraces began to droop, and sheets of water rolled over the land as if mocking every shovel load he'd ever carted. He waited for praise or advice, but the only words that drifted up the path were reminders that some fights are meant for bigger men. Out in the drizzle, the boy wiped his sleeves across his cheeks and looked down at the battered field. Everything ached. Still, the urge to finish one more row lingered. Even when the world seemed not to care, he lugged another rock up from the creek, convinced that invisible things, like effort or patience, could grow strong too, if you just wouldn't let go. Instead of giving in, the boy began asking questions. He remembered stories his grandfather once told, how mountainside farmers in other countries had tamed wild slopes, not by fighting stones, but by working with them. Late at night, by the light of a battered lamp, he paged through old library books about terracing, sketching diagrams on envelope backs. Each morning, he set out to imitate the wisdom found in those pages, stacking rocks along the contour like a patchwork spine, easing the land's steepest angles into shallow steps. With every new wall, he learned more. When a downpour threatened, he shaped spillways through his stonework, channeling runoff into shallow trenches instead of letting it rage unchecked. He lined gullies with armloads of small stones to slow the flow, placed larger boulders like keystones so the earth behind would hold steady. He watched raindrops slide, captured by the terraced ledges instead of splashing straight downhill. Where many had dumped rocks out of spite, he arranged them as puzzle pieces, borrowing every useful idea from old drawings and the sharp-eyed elders who watched from porches. The first real sign of change wasn't visible to most. His crops weren't yet thriving, and visitors still saw only gray mounds and odd looping walls. But he noticed the soil behind the terraces stayed lighter and damp after a storm. Small weeds appeared where nothing had grown since his father's day. The sound of rain didn't bring dread, but a sort of cautious hope. The land felt less brittle, more like a thing that could give back. He glanced up one day to see an old neighbor pausing on the lane, not laughing, but really watching. No one else understood yet, but in the stubborn, careful work of walling rocks, the boy saw the hillside shape, slowly learning to listen. Early summer brought disaster with a roar louder than any mocking word. A week of soaking storms battered the hills above the village, sending mud and water rolling down from every side. As others rushed to protect homes and barns, the boy watched from his porch as the first slide crashed into his topmost wall, sending weeks of effort slumping into a muddy heap. Water coursed through his channels, some holding, others giving way. Smaller walls tumbled, stones scattered like bones down the slope. The farm looked bruised and hopeless. His hard-won progress unraveled almost overnight. He walked the soaked field in silence, numb with defeat. For once the laughter and skepticism seemed justified, even his own hope stung like a bruise. Neighbors passed with quiet sympathy, but one old man stopped beside the ruins of a broken terrace. Instead of offering pity, he recalled a memory from his youth, how, after the worst flood in living memory, his own father had rebuilt their fields with patience, not anger, saying, "The earth always tests the wall twice before it keeps anything." The lesson was more than advice. It was a lifeline. That evening, the boy sat in the ruins, running stones through his muddy hands, letting sorrow drain away as the sky cleared. In the hush after the storm resolve returned, he would build again, stronger and wiser, not in spite of what the land had done, but because of it. The village barely had time to dry out when the real storms swept in. Heavy rains clattered off rooftops and rushed in swirling brown torrents down the hillsides, louder and more furious than any in recent memory. This time, however, the boy was ready. As fields on both sides of the valley began to slip and slide, young corn washed away, fences half buried in silt, he hurried to his wall. He watched, heart pounding, as the swelling creeks hit the lowest row of rocks and miraculously broke, water rolling along new channels instead of tearing into his crops. One terrace rippled but held, the next, with roots interlaced between stones, barely shifted. Slowly, as rain battered and wind howled, patchy green held their ground along the boy's patchwork hill. After the worst passed, word spread faster than floodwater. Curious neighbors sloshed through mud to see why his slope remained intact. A dappled quilt where others' fields had turned to ruin. They ran their hands along the muddy stonework, tested the terraces, and stared at the rows of crops mud-free behind the walls. Men who'd once laughed the loudest now shook his hand in awe. "How did you keep it standing?" they asked. The boy explained how he shaped each spillway, how every stone had its work, how listening to stories and learning from failure was the only way to build something that lasts. Children called it a miracle terrace. Elders called it old wisdom, finally remembered. The mocking tone faded from conversation. Instead, the valley echoed with plans, how more of the hilltop could be saved, who had stones to spare, and what they'd build together before the next rains. In the silence that followed, the boy stood tall for the first time, knowing his burden had become his gift to all. The storms turned what was once a private struggle into a communal mission. Word spread that the boy's stone terraces had shielded not just his own field, but slowed the water enough to blunt the force racing toward his neighbor's garden below. By midsummer, men and women from across the valley came with gloves and carts, bringing their own burdens of unwanted rocks to help reinforce the boy's design. Where once laughter and teasing rang out, now advice and encouragement filled the air. Together, they stacked and reshaped the walls, learning how to fit odd stones tight, how to lace roots through gaps, how to build water forks so every terrace held. The young ones ran bucket relays, elders relished showing how their grandparents placed cornerstones, and for the first time in memory, everyone pitched in before the next round of storms. Neighboring fields that copied his terraces soon watched their rows of beans and corn stand untouched, even as rain lashed the hillsides again. Across the valley, old enemies swapped knowledge, and new friendships grew in the steady work of carrying, building, and repairing. Yet the greatest reward wasn't the fruit or the crops, but the subtle changes, nods of respect from those who once doubted, quiet words of thanks at sunset, a place at the table during the village harvest. When laughter broke at the old shop, it was honest, full of relief and pride, and when the boy walked his wall in the evening, he knew what he'd carried had changed more than his own fortune. It had made the whole hillside new. He didn't just fit stone on stone, he'd stacked hope where none had held before. Seasons turned, and the village slopes grew quilted with green. Terraces blooming, where mudslides once cut deep scars. Children played atop sturdy walls, as elders traded stories under fruit-heavy trees, the boys' stonework now part of the landscape itself. The memory of laughter and skepticism faded, replaced by a quiet pride that lingered in every cared-for row. Fields that were once a burden now fed the valley, each stone a reminder that struggle can become strength when shared. Looking out from his old wall, the boy, now grown, knew that carrying what others called a burden had saved his farm and changed his home. The story lingered, a living question for every new season. What might you carry, even when the world calls it foolish, not just for yourself, but for everyone uphill and down?